Little Mrs. Millikin by Enid Blyton. Mrs. Millikin was a tiny old lady who lived in Nod village. She hadn't any children of her own, so she loved everybody else's. She loved little Peter, who lived at the grocer's. She loved Susie Green, who lived at the post office. She loved the baby next door, and she loved the twins across the road, although they were really very naughty sometimes. And they all loved Mrs. Millikin. When they saw her coming, they ran to her, shouting, "Millikin, Millikin, have you got a sweet for us? Millikin, tell us a story." Mrs. Millikin spent all her money on sweets and toys for other people's children. She made chocolate biscuits every week to put into a tin that she kept for the children when they came to see her. She remembered all their birthdays and bought them cards and presents. They loved her very much, and when the twins made her a pincushion for her birthday, little Mrs. Millikin was so proud of it that she showed it to quite 100 people. She kept it in the middle of her mantelpiece and hardly dared to put a pin or needle in it for fear of spoiling it. Of course, you can imagine that when Christmas time came, Mrs. Millikin went quite mad. She spent all her money on things like balloons and crackers and toys and sweets, and gave them to all the children she knew. She saved up for weeks before so that she could have a really good spend. Then, what a time she had! She went to the toy shop and bought dolls, toys, and books. She went to the sweet shop and bought packets of sweets and boxes of chocolate and tins of biscuits. She went to the bookshop and bought all kinds of merry cards. Really, she had a perfectly lovely time. But she was happiest of all when she gave what she had bought to the children and heard all their squeals of joy and saw their beaming faces. "That's my best Christmas present," she always said. "That's my very best Christmas present, seeing the children so happy and excited." Now, one Christmas, little Mrs. Millikin planned all her presents as usual. Ships for the twins, a doll for Susie Green, one that opened and shut its eyes, books for Bobby, a rattle for the baby. Oh, she would have a fine time spending all her money. Little Mrs. Millikin worked very hard to get her money. She scrubbed Mrs. Jones's floors for her. She washed Mrs. Lacey's curtains. She mended Mr. Tim's socks. And by the time Christmas week came, she had a purse full of money to spend. So out she went to spend it at the toy shop and the sweet shop. And then a really dreadful thing happened. Little Mrs. Millikin had a hole in her skirt pocket, and she didn't know it. She put her purse there, and as she walked along to the village, the purse dropped out. Mrs. Millikin didn't hear it fall, so she didn't know. When she got to the toy shop, she put her hand into her pocket to get out her purse, and it wasn't there. What a shock for her! The tiny old lady ran back along the road to see if she could find it. Oh, but she couldn't find it anywhere. And no wonder she couldn't, for a nasty man had spied it on the ground and had picked it up in joy. He had gone off with it, thinking that he would buy himself a really fine Christmas dinner. So little Mrs. Millikin didn't find her purse at all. She was very unhappy. "Now I can't buy the children any presents," she thought, with tears in her eyes. "The twins must do without their ships. Oh, I did promise to give them each one, and Susie can't have her doll. This is really dreadful." She did not think that she would not have any Christmas dinner herself. She had meant to buy something for her own dinner on Christmas Day. Now she would have to have bread and jam. But all she worried about was not being able to buy presents for the children. She went to bed very unhappy on Christmas Eve. She had a very little bed because She was a very little person. It was a cold night, so she drew the blanket right over her head to keep warm. She didn't go to sleep for a long time, but at last she shut her eyes and fell fast asleep. Now, as you know, Santa Claus comes along each Christmas Eve and fills the children's stockings with toys. He doesn't bother about grown-ups, of course. They can buy all they want for themselves. Well, this Christmas Eve, quite by mistake, Santa Claus went down the wrong chimney. He thought he was going down Susie Green's chimney, and he wasn't. He was going down little Mrs. Millikin's. When he got into her bedroom, he stared round. This wasn't Susie Green's room. He must have come down the wrong chimney. What a nuisance! Then he caught sight of little Mrs. Millikin lying on her little tiny bed. She was a very small person, no bigger than a child, and as she had the blanket pulled right up to her hair, Santa Claus couldn't see that she wasn't a child. He quite thought she was. She was so small. "Now here's a funny thing," said Santa to himself, turning over the pages of his notebook till he came to the names of all the children in Nod Village. "Here's a very funny thing. I haven't got this child's name down. How lucky that I happened to come down the chimney. This child would have had no presents from me if I hadn't come along tonight by mistake, and that would have been a great pity." Santa Claus stared at the bed. He wondered if it was a boy or a girl. He didn't know. He couldn't see the face of the sleeping person. He didn't like to pull down the blanket in case he woke up the sleeper. "Well, I don't really know what to do," said Santa, scratching his head and frowning. "It may be a boy, it may be a girl, it may even be a baby, though it looks rather too big for that. What had I better do? And where's the stocking for me to fill? There doesn't seem to be one, so I simply can't tell what child it is, boy, girl, or baby." He looked round the little bedroom. He saw a pair of old Mr. Tim's socks that Mrs. Millikin had just washed and darned and had put ready to take back to him. "Good," he said, "those will do nicely." He unrolled them and hung them at the foot of the little bed. Then he undid his sack and looked inside. "If he's a boy, he will like ships and boats," he said, and he put a ship and a boat into a stocking. "If she's a girl, she will like dolls." He put a beautiful doll into the stocking so that it peeped out at the top. It could open and shut its eyes, and it had golden curls and a blue ribbon. "If it's a baby, it will like a rattle," said Santa, and into the stocking went a blue and red rattle. Then old Santa dived into his sack again and brought out some books, an engine, and a race game. "I didn't give this child anything at all last year," he thought. "Poor little thing. I'd better make up for it this year." So he packed into those 2 big stockings all sorts of lovely things: sweets, biscuits, oranges, nuts, apples, little animals, balls, and even a toy telephone, which he knew most children really loved. Then up the chimney he went again and disappeared into the frosty night. Mrs. Millikin heard the bells of the reindeer in her dreams, but they didn't wake her up. She didn't open her eyes till the morning. And then how she stared and stared! At the bottom of her bed hung 2 large stockings. From one peeped a pretty golden-haired doll. From the other stared a large wooden soldier. "I must still be asleep," said Mrs. Millikin, "or else I've gone back to being a child. Which is it?" She got out of bed and looked at herself in the mirror. No, she was still Mrs. Millikin, with curly grey hair and a wrinkled, smiling face. But it wasn't a dream either. "Most peculiar," thought Mrs. Millikin, looking at the stockings again. "It almost looks as if Santa Claus has been here and filled these stockings for me. What shall I do about it?" And then, of course, she knew quite well what she was going to do about it. "I'll give all the toys to the children," she cried. "How pleased they will be. Here are just the things they want: a ship, a boat, an engine, a doll, a rattle. Oh, what marvellous things, to be sure!" You would have been surprised to see how quickly Mrs. Millikin dressed that morning. She was out of the house in 15 minutes, carrying all the toys. And what a wonderful time she had, giving away all those presents. How the children hugged and kissed her. "What have you got for your Christmas dinner, Millikin?" asked Susie Green, hugging her doll in joy. "We've got turkey and plum pudding. Ooh!" "Well, I've got bread and jam, and that's all," said Mrs. Millikin. "But I shall be just as happy with that as you will be with your turkey and plum pudding, because, you see, I've seen so many smiling faces this morning that they are as good as a feast to me." "Millikin, you must stay and share my dinner," said Susie. "Mustn't she, Mummy? Do say yes." "Of course she must," said Mummy, and Mrs. Millikin had to. Then she went to tea with Bobby and shared his Christmas tree. So she had a marvellous Christmas after all. "Best I've ever had," she said to herself as she cuddled down into her small bed that night. "Best I've ever had. And I'm sure I don't know what I've done to deserve it. But I know quite a lot of things, don't you?" Merry Christmas, everyone.